Hello, I'm Colleen Wilcox, Superintendent of Schools for Santa Clara County and co-chair of Silicon Valley Reads. On behalf of my co-chairs, Jane Light, San Jose City Librarian, and Melinda Cervantes, Santa Clara County Librarian, I want to welcome you to this special Silicon Valley Reads experience. The book we selected for Silicon Valley Reads 2007 is The Tortilla Curtain by T.C. Boyle. It is a book with many themes relevant to our diverse population, and it touches on some of the most difficult issues we face as a nation. I want to thank Sal Pissarro of the Mercury News and our author, T.C. Boyle, for allowing us to videotape this interview. I hope you will find this conversation insightful and thought-provoking. And now, let's watch T.C. Boyle and Sal Pissarro discuss The Tortilla Curtain.
Hello, I'm Sal Pissarro, a columnist with the San Jose Mercury News. We're talking today with T.C. Boyle, author of 19, soon to be 20 books and numerous short stories. And we're going to be talking about The Tortilla Curtain, a book of his which was published in 1995 and which has been selected as the 2007 book for Silicon Valley Reads. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Sal.
First, can we talk about the genesis of the book?
Sure. I was living in Los Angeles at the time and had been there since 1978. I grew up in New York. I'd never been west of the Hudson River until I was 21. I subsequently went to Iowa to the Writers' Workshop. I moved to LA to teach at USC. And in that period, it was prior to Prop 187, 2 years prior to Prop 187, there was a lot of talk about illegal immigration. Probably the LA Times every other day had an article about Mexican culture, about people in gated communities, back and forth. Everywhere I went, this was on people's minds. And so I wrote a book in order to sort things out for myself. I don't know what I'm going to say or feel or do in any given book of fiction until it evolves. It's a kind of puzzle for me. And so I wrote this for my own benefit. And of course, it's been amazing to me that it spoke so directly to an issue that people have adopted it, not only throughout this country, but throughout the world, as an essential text.
So where did you get the voices for the characters? There seems to be a little bit of you in at least one of them.
There's a little bit of me in all four characters, and I think that's inevitable for any novelist to be invested in his characters. And I try to stretch my boundaries as much as possible to do what I haven't done before. For instance, to inhabit a woman like America Rincon, a female of another culture. Can I do that? Can I make that convincing? And I think, in my mind anyway, a good novelist should be able to be anybody and do anything. Along these lines, by the way, my proudest moment is in a story called Big Game, in which for a couple of paragraphs I got to inhabit the mind of an elephant, Bessie B, and she's very, very angry.
Well, it certainly is a bit of a stretch for you to inhabit all these characters, and I think some critics did hound you pretty badly when the book came out about that. Do you think that was fair for them to do that?
Well, no, it's never fair. All I deserve is praise and glory.
All praise to you.
Yes, but if you think about it, it's a testimony to the power of the book that it riled up so many people in so many ways. But within 2 or 3 years of the book's publication, it was already a classic and already being taught in all the schools, not only in California, but throughout the nation. And as I say, every German kid today in German schools has to read this for their exams in English. I think people look at the book and they see it from their own point of view, and they believe that I'm their advocate, so that the racists believe that I'm their advocate. The liberals believe that I'm their advocate, although, of course, they attack me because I seem like an apostate because I'm making fun of certain liberal values, in the case of Delaney, for instance. The people who most upset me are the nunnery of the politically correct, these people who feel that they can control what we can say and what we can't, in the interest, of course, ultimately, of having a more multicultural society. But in fact, it's become a kind of orthodoxy in itself. So that they were absurd enough to say that I have no right to write from the point of view of a Mexican immigrant because I'm not Mexican. But if you follow that line of reasoning, then How could I write about a woman or a dog or anything else? So that was the thing that upset me most of all. But that seems to have receded into the background because of the very absurdity of it.
And weren't most of those critics, they weren't Mexican critics themselves?
No, they weren't. That's correct. In fact, what I've heard from Latinos in general is that they feel that they have an advocate in me. By the way, there is a Spanish translation of this, and it's my only Spanish book in American Spanish. All the others are in Castilian from Spain. This is done by Grupo Norma from Colombia. When Santa Barbara did this book for their One City, One Book, I donated some copies to the library in Spanish, and they ran them off on the press, and people could read it in Spanish. However, it's hard to get. Colombia is a country in turmoil. It was $28 for a paperback. So I have been advocating with Penguin to do a bilingual edition. About 10 years ago, they considered it in their various committees, and they said, no, we can't market this, and so on. Since then, however, for instance, Garcia Marquez came out first with his memoir in Spanish before it came out in English here in this country, and it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. So I'm now militating with my publisher again to have a bilingual edition, because all the kids are reading this in school. And obviously, the parents of some of these kids only read Spanish. And wouldn't it be great, and for just Spanish language classes, for people to have both texts together? So I'm trying to get the publisher to do this. I don't know whether the publisher will or not, but I think it would be a great thing.
I think it would be really an interesting thing to see what the reaction would be amongst the Spanish-reading parents.
Yeah.
And it appears you were working out your thoughts on immigration with this book. In the decade that's passed, have your thoughts changed at all?
No, not at all. Again, I'm not running for office. I don't have solutions. I am simply expressing myself in a work of art. And one thing that this book examines is an environmental impact. Delaney is an environmentalist. There's no reason why he shouldn't live in a nice house and have a nice sleeping bag and camp out in the woods. It's okay. On the other hand, who is the enemy of the environment? We people of any species, of any race or ethnicity. Our species is the problem. So that anybody coming from anywhere, the higher the population, the worse the pollution, the fewer animals, etc., the less open land. So that problem remains insoluble. As far as borders are concerned, and the wall we were talking about earlier, and the whole metaphor of the wall in here, from the Tortilla Curtain to the walled Arroyo Blanco estates, etc., I wonder on a species level, a biological level, we are all one species, whether walls mean anything, or even countries mean anything anymore. The coyotes in this book stand as a metaphor for us. The coyotes, they're out in the hills right here this morning. I see their scat right out here in the hills. They don't observe borders. They're one species. They will go wherever the water is, wherever the resources are. And so will we. So I wonder if it makes even sense to talk about nations and ethnic groups anymore. That said, though, you are noticing the wars that are raging around the world. And they are wars for resources, the declining resources of this world. And we have seen in the last 20 years ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, in Africa. These are tribal wars of ethnic groups against ethnic groups fighting to the death for the last resources. If there were fewer of us, of any group, there would be a lot more resources and there'd be a lot more open space and a lot more animals. So the situation is complicated far beyond national politics. And I hope that the subtext of this book speaks to it. And by the way, Sal, coming out of this, a few years later, I wrote a book called A Friend of the Earth, dealing with specifically just environmental issues and global warming. That was in the year 2000.
I think the environmental issues in the book get overshadowed by the immigration issues. But I found it interesting to read when you mentioned the coyotes represent us, that there are several predators in the book. And I think the coyote is seen as one predator. Jose Navidad is seen as another
Yes.
type of predator. And I found Kira Mossbacher to be a third predator and possibly the most dangerous of all three.
If I can try to imagine how you see that, I would say it's because she is not aware of what's happening in the world in any sense. She's so involved in her own career, which is to sell houses, that she doesn't really understand what's happening on the streets and has no sympathy for anybody except her own career. And of course, a lot of us are like that. We only see one thing, the career before us, and don't see nature, don't see the suffering of other people, don't see anything. What I like about her, if I can reflect on my own book, is the idea of, for instance, the DeRoss house. She has these enormous vacant houses that are for sale because it's a real estate market. Somebody's making money on it. No one's living there. You know? These enormous mansions that are being built everywhere could house hundreds of people, but they won't. And of course, they are destroying the environment as well.
And as people read the book, they'll certainly see that some of these large houses sort of get their comeuppance for not being put to the best use.
Absolutely. And, you know, speaking of immigrant groups, too, I was criticized by some idiot for having the very lines when Delaney is arguing this with Jack in the supermarket. Delaney says, "But we are a nation of immigrants." Of course, that is exactly what everyone says. And it's true. So that I've done a lot of historical novels, and I'm particularly intrigued with the era of around 1900, 1910, 1920. I wrote The Road to Wellville set then. I'm writing a book about Frank Lloyd Wright now, which takes place partly in that era. In order to do research for that, I will read the novels of the period, Theodore Dreiser, for instance. The immigrant group then in the Midwest that was looked down upon because they're lazy, they're uneducated, and they're ugly, were the Swedes, with their ridiculous yellow hair and blue eyes, and their preposterous language too. And of course, they've integrated. You know, people seem to forget. Look at boxing, for instance. Boxing always has immigrant groups boxing. So in the 20s, it was the Irish. Then it was the Italians. Then it was African Americans. Then it was Latinos. Now we're seeing Russian fighters and Asian fighters. You know, so I think people make a little bit too much of the question of integration and Americanization also, which I think is inevitable.
That it just always seems to happen, just not as soon as the mainstream country seems to want it to.
We all have xenophobia. I mean, in Mexico, there is tremendous xenophobia and abuse of the immigrants from the South who are coming through Chiapas and coming to our border and cross from Guatemala, from El Salvador. We don't think about that because we don't know about that, but that's a fact too. There is also a fact, as I point out in here, of skin color within the Mexican culture. There's also a kind of macho culture, which I'm talking about here. Candido is no perfect human being. If he were, the book would be a kind of tract. You know, I think all four characters have to have flaws and perhaps some positive points too. Otherwise, it becomes too theoretical. It becomes a kind of preaching. I'm not preaching. I'm not advocating anything through the novel itself. Of course, you know what I stand for. You've read my books. I could give you a 100-question quiz, and you could say, does he stand for this and that? And you know. But I don't think a novel is supposed to advocate anything. It's supposed to seduce the reader to think more deeply for him or herself. So people say, this is your most political book. And I try to stand back from that and say, no, it's not really. It does deal with a political issue. But so does A Friend of the Earth. The environment's a political issue. Are we going to destroy it or preserve it? Art has to invite the viewer, the reader, to come into this world in his own way and make his own opinion. Otherwise, you should write an essay, give a speech, you know, if you want to advocate. But you shouldn't make art. Art is totally apart from that.
Instead, you're presenting and allowing other people to take from it what they will and draw their own interpretations.
I hope so, Sal. I think that's what an artist is supposed to do.
Now, your four main characters, as you talked about, you imbue them with some positive and some negative traits in all cases. I mean, Candido is in no way a purely positive, naive character. He does a lot of things in the book that I think people would at least frown upon, if not be sometimes horrified by. But the comic satire that you're actually very well known for in your books tends to be mostly directed at our suburban naturalist and his wife.
Good point. And you know what? I didn't plan it this way. The book just evolves. I think non-writers will find it hard to believe, but every story I've written in every novel just begins, and I follow it. Obviously, as I go along, I have ideas of where it's going, what it means, why I'm doing it, but it just evolves. And as this evolved, I realized that the people whose behavior might be held up to a fine light are Delaney and Kyra, because they're unconscious of what's happening. They mean well, or he means well at any rate. He's an environmentalist. He's recycling. He is a liberal. He wants to believe in liberal values. And yet I wonder, we all think that we would act bravely in a critical situation, but maybe we wouldn't. We all think that if we were in Delaney's situation when he has the accident with Candido, that we would do the right thing. And maybe we would, but maybe we wouldn't. Just in Santa Barbara recently, there were 2 deaths of hit-and-run drivers. We would all think that we wouldn't run away, but maybe we would. And so, your observation is correct. As the book evolved, yes, I'm not painting Candido in America to be perfect, otherwise it wouldn't work. But they're not so much figures of satire as are Delaney and Kyra. It just seemed to evolve that way.
Although certainly with Candido, as events progress in the book, you do get a sense that nothing will ever go right for this man.
Well, don't forget, his namesake is Voltaire's Candide. And it helps me to organize the book to have these mounting ironies. It is all built on ironical juxtapositions. So that, as I said earlier, there's nothing wrong with a person like you or me taking our sleeping bag and going out in the hills for the night to enjoy nature. But when you juxtapose it with the fact that people are living in the canyon, living rough because they have no other choice, then it becomes satiric and ironic all at once.
And while there's a lot of satire, I think, in the book, it doesn't come off as too comic. And is that because of the seriousness of the subject? I mean, you're dealing with a lot of real fear with people here, and there's some very tense and somewhat horrible moments that happen.
Yeah, good point. When I first began writing in my first book, Descent of Man, all the stories are pretty wild and satiric and very funny and didn't really deal with character so much. I didn't really know much about character. I learned how to deal with that as I wrote novels. And also, comedy to me was more of a satiric, slapstick kind of thing. But now I think, as I've matured as a writer, I try to work with many kinds of comedy. My book, The Inner Circle of 2003, is about Alfred C. Kinsey, the sex researcher. And I would say that it's a comic novel, but one in which you don't laugh out loud, you cringe. It's that kind of comedy. And I think you get that kind of comedy in this book, The Tortilla Curtain, as well. You think, geez, that's outrageous, or how could they do that, or how could they think that? And maybe you have an inward laugh, but it's not a pleasant comedy. It's not a broad, world-embracing economy. It's a dark, satiric kind of comedy.
The novel is spotted throughout with some columns written by Delaney for his magazine. Was it fun to write those, to get into that voice, or was that difficult for you?
It was pure fun. One of my all-time heroes is Annie Dillard. She is a nature writer and a philosopher. She's very attuned to the earth. If you haven't read her, I recommend her highly. She wrote a great book called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And so Delaney, she's Delaney's hero, and that's why his is called Pilgrim at Topanga Creek. I'm trying to not imitate Annie Dillard because she is an exquisite writer, but to give a sense of how Delaney might try to imitate her. You know, it's so tricky.
And sort of his outrageousness with it.
Yes. In my latest novel, Boyle Talk, my heroine is deaf, and she has written a novel herself. It was originally attached to the novel as an appendix called Wild Child, about the wild child of Aveyron in France.
Mm-hmm.
My publisher talked me out of it, so I published it separately in McSweeney's, this novella. And I had the wonderful, wonderful opportunity to have a Borgesian afternote and say that, well, of course, you can see that I'm mentioned as the author here, but how would I know so much about deaf